Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5, 1 through 6. We are in the middle of our series called The Heart of the Kingdom, where we are looking specifically at the Beatitudes, and then we will transition from there into the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. But let me read the first 6 verses of Matthew 5 just to refresh us of where we've been and our passage for this morning. Matthew 5, 1 through 6. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." You know, our human appetites can be funny. If there's any group of people that know this better than anyone else, it's all the pregnant women in our church. I've never been pregnant, but I've spent a grand total of 25 months with a pregnant woman. That's over 2 years of my life navigating cravings and mood swings and irrational food demands, all while never getting any sympathy for it, right? If you've ever been around a pregnant woman or you've been one yourself, you know that pregnancy cravings are not a casual suggestion. When Anne was pregnant with our firstborn, Nicole, she craved fish curry, and like our entire life depended on it. Our church family back then would rally to keep that fish curry supplied, and if that wasn't there, my mom would FedEx frozen ship curry from Philly. And to this day, when Nicole comes home from college, she will ask anyone in the house to make fish curry for her. And then Tim came along. Anne's craving? Steak. Lots of steak. You know what's expensive? Steak. You know what's still expensive? Steak. And to this day, that boy, any chance we ask him what he wants to eat, you know what he's asking for? Steak. And then there's Micah, and Micah was a reprieve because Anne didn't crave anything at all, which is also a relief because that kid can go like an entire day without eating any food. But here's the thing with cravings. They don't wait. A pregnant mom doesn't think, oh, I might like some fries later. It's, no, I need fries now. Call 911. It's an emergency. I need fries right now. Back when we were expecting Nicole, we had no church responsibilities. We lived in an apartment not too far from here. And our weekend routine was we would go to this store called Blockbuster, and we would rent this thing called a DVD. And we would get like 3 or 4 DVDs of this show called 24. And then we would, in an entire weekend, binge watch Jack Bauer's Saving the World while we stayed up way too late doing nothing. And on one of those weekends at 1 a.m., Anne suddenly had this craving for jelly beans. And it was not like, oh, I desire jelly beans. It's, I need jelly beans. And so 1 a.m., I'm driving to Walmart in the middle of the night to keep my pregnant wife happy. I return home, jelly beans in hand, expecting gratitude. And she looks at me and she goes, "I meant gummy bears." And that's when I learned that pregnancy cravings are a high-stake guessing game where the only prize is in avoiding a hangry wife is going back and getting gummy bears for her. Friends, this is the kind of hunger that Jesus is talking about. Not for food, but for something even greater. In the Beatitudes, Jesus describes people who are truly blessed. And he says one of the marks of people who are truly blessed is that they hunger and they thirst for righteousness. They don't just casually wish for righteousness the way that you and I might wish for a snack in between meals. They crave for it. They long for it. And Jesus tells us that the good life, the truly blessed life, the happy life, is not found in being full and satisfied with the things of this world, but it's having this insatiable hunger and thirst for the righteousness of God. Because according to Jesus, this is the path to the good life. It's an upside down vision from what the world tells us, but it's the life that he calls us into. And today we're going to explore what that means together. As we continue into the series of the Beatitudes, we're going to wrestle with three questions this morning. Number one, what does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? Number two, how do we develop this kind of craving for the things of God? And then three, what does Jesus promise to those who live with this deep, holy hunger? So the first thing I want to look at is, what is righteousness? What is righteousness? Before we can truly understand what Jesus is inviting us to hunger for, we need to first ask, what is righteousness? What does this word mean in the context of the Beatitudes? Righteousness is a word that carries deep significance throughout the Bible, and it plays a central role in Jesus' teachings and his ministry, especially on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus mentions righteousness multiple times in the Sermon on the Mount, making it clear that it's not a side issue, but it's a defining characteristics of those who belong to Jesus' kingdom. But if we look at righteousness today, it's not a very popular word in our culture. Let's be honest, how often do we use the word righteous in our everyday conversation? It's not exactly something you'd put on your resume or list on your dating profile, right? Imagine scrolling through your dating profile on a dating app and you see someone that wrote that they describe themselves as righteous, right? It probably wouldn't be the most attractive trait at first glance. Why? Because in our world today, righteousness often carries a negative connotation. For many, when you hear the word righteous, it brings to mind self-righteous. An image is someone who is holier than thou, someone who's judgmental, someone who's morally superior. It might sound like someone who's rigid or uptight or disconnected from the struggles of reality and life. In some circles, righteousness is associated with legalism, rules without relationships, morality without mercy, and it can feel like a burden rather than an invitation, something to avoid rather than something to long and crave for. But here's the thing, that's not what Jesus meant when he talks about righteousness. When Jesus speaks about righteousness, he wasn't talking about cold, legalistic, rule-following people. He wasn't promoting self-righteousness, where we measure ourselves against others and pridefully declare how better we are than other people. He wasn't calling people to strive for perfection in their own strength so that they could boast about, look at all the good things I've done. No, what Jesus was describing is something completely different, something that's actually life-giving, something that's beautiful, something that's worth hungering and thirsting for. So what did Jesus mean when he spoke of righteousness? And that's what we need to unpack, because Jesus' definition of righteousness will shape how we respond to his invitation to hunger and thirst for it. To truly grasp what Jesus is inviting us to hunger and thirst for, we have to dig deeper into the meaning of righteousness. What did this word mean to the first century Jews who heard it when Jesus spoke it? How would his Jewish audience have understood it? One of the most important principles of reading the Bible is recognizing that words carry cultural and historical significance. When we hear righteousness today, we think of it in a different term. But when Jesus was talking about it, he's referring to something much bigger, something rich in the Jewish tradition. The Greek word that Jesus uses in this passage is the word dekasune, a word that frequently appears both in the Old and New Testament. And when the Greek translation of this word, the Septuagint, helps us see how this word is understood by Jesus' audience. Let me give you a few examples from the Old Testament. In Leviticus 19, do not act unjustly when deciding a case. Do not be partial to the poor, give preference to the rich. Judge your neighbor in dekasune, or in righteousness. Here it's linked to fairness, to being impartial in the legal system. Righteousness means treating people justly. Don't show favoritism. Make sure the poor and the powerful are given equal treatment. Don't put one over the other. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 8, it says, what great nation has righteous statutes or dekasune statutes and ordinances like this entire law I set before you? Moses here is describing God's law as righteous. It's not just about personal morality. It's about living according to God's ways, aligning our lives to God's heart of mercy and justice and truth. In Isaiah, the prophet writes, "Isn't this the fast that I chose? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set up the oppressed free, to tear off every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the poor and homeless into your house? Then your dekasune, your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard." And here God is rebuking his people for focusing on outward religious rituals while neglecting things like justice and mercy. True righteousness, friends, is not just personal piety. It's about actively caring for the vulnerable around us. It's about being people of justice. It's about bringing restoration to what is broken. And each of these examples show that righteousness is far more than just a personal pursuit of holiness. It's about being in right relationship with God, with others, and with the world. It means living in a way that reflects God's truth, his justice and love in every aspect of our lives. And so when Jesus says to us, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," he's not merely just talking about personal morality. He's describing a deep, all-consuming longing to see the world made right. He's speaking to those who yearn for a world where justice is upheld, where relationships are restored, and where the weak and the vulnerable are cared for, and where God's kingdom's values shapes the way that we live. John Stott, the theologian, put it this way. He said, "Biblical righteousness is more than a private and personal affair. It includes social righteousness as well. And social righteousness, as we learn from the law and the prophets, is concerned with seeking man's liberation from oppression, together with the promotion of civil rights, justice in law courts, integrity in business dealings, honor in the home and family affairs. And thus Christians are committed to hunger for righteousness in the whole human community as something that is pleasing to a righteous God." Righteousness, if you wanted a definition, can be defined as the world that is made right, or the world made whole. Jesus later in the Sermon on the Mount would say these words. He'd say, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his ikasune, his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." In other words, to seek righteousness is to seek God's kingdom. To long for righteousness is to long for the world to be remade as God intends. To hunger for righteousness is to ache for the world that is healed, whole, and fully aligned to the will of God. So when Jesus says that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are blessed, he's describing people who refuse to accept the brokenness of the world as it is. He's speaking to those who have a deep longing for the renewal of justice, for peace. He's talking about people who are not content to live comfortably while others suffer, who are restless until God's kingdom breaks through on this earth. Before we move on, I want to pause and acknowledge something. One of the reasons I love the Bible is because it refuses to fit into neat categories. It challenges assumptions, shatters our boxes, and speaks to realities deeper than our cultural or political divisions in our world today. One of the biggest divides in our culture today is between those who emphasize personal morality, things like integrity and responsibility and strong families, and those who emphasize justice and systemic changes, addressing inequality and oppression and historical wrongs. And too often, these sides will speak past each other. One sees the other side as excusing responsibility, while the other sees the counterpart as blind to systemic injustices. But here's the thing, friends. The Bible refuses to pick a side. The righteousness that Jesus calls us to, dekasuna, is not an either or. It's a both and. It is a call to holiness, integrity, and self-control. But it also commands us to pursue justice, defend the oppressed, and seek equity. These are not opposing ideas. These are two sides of the same coin. And here's the danger. If you and I fit perfectly into one camp, If our beliefs about righteousness align so neatly into a political or a cultural ideology that we never are challenged, maybe you have drifted too far from a biblical vision of righteousness. And if our faith only calls us to personal virtue but never disrupts the systems around us, maybe we have settled for shallow morality. And if our faith calls us to advocate for justice but never confronts the sins of our hearts, maybe we have embraced a hollow activism. Take poverty, for example. If we only focus on personal issues and we ignore the real injustices that keep people trapped in cycles of struggles, and we only talk about, or if we only talk about systemic changes, we overlook the dignity and agency of individuals who can make choices that shape their future. True righteousness, friends, compels us to care about both personal holiness and the injustices of this world. The same can be said of race and education and criminal justice and economic opportunities, all the social issues of our time. If we are people of righteousness, you and I cannot settle for easy answers. We cannot dismiss morality as unimportant, nor can we dismiss justice as unnecessary. Instead, we must pursue righteousness wherever they are broken. And let me say this plainly. As followers of Jesus, you and I are not a voting bloc. We do not belong to a party. We are not defined by conservative or progressive labels. We do not get to care about one side of righteousness while ignoring the other. We are called to be people of a different kingdom. People who hunger and thirst for righteousness that is deeper and wider than any political movement in our day and culture today. People who refuse to be divided into factions because we are first and foremost citizens of heaven, seeking his kingdom come, his will be done on earth as it is heaven, because we only have one king and his name is Jesus. So if we are going to be righteous people, we must be committed to personal transformation and the renewal of society around us, to holiness and to justice, to integrity and to mercy, to repentance and restoration. Because righteousness, friends, is not just something we believe, it is something you and I must live. This is what righteousness looks like. It is a world that is made right in our hearts, in our relationships, in our communities, and in the world. That's righteousness. But what does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? What does it mean to feel this deep, driving desire for dekasune, the way that Jesus describes it? I think we all know what it's like to be physically hungry. I don't know about you, but when I am hungry, I end up being hangry. Right? I get irritable, I get distracted, unable to focus on anything else until I get something to eat. A few years ago, I was invited to a ministry meeting that started at 12, and the invitation said that there was going to be lunch. And so I showed up, and I sat down, and I expected that at any moment, food would appear. And as the meeting started, I realized there's no lunch. There's no food, there's nothing. And at first, I thought, oh, it's just delayed. Maybe Chipotle was late. 5 minutes passes by, then 10, then 15. Chick-fil-A has probably a lot of Christian ministries ordering from them. And by that point, I wasn't listening to anything the speaker was saying. All of it was like Charlie Brown, wah, 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 wah in the background. I couldn't believe that a meeting where a lunch was promised at a Christian meeting, that they lied and no one brought food to the table. And by the time the food finally arrived, I had already missed half the conversation. Right? I didn't even know why I was there. And here's the thing that experience taught me. Hunger makes you intensely aware of what is missing. Hunger makes you intensely aware of what is missing. You feel the absence. You ache for what you lack. Now imagine that same level of hunger, but instead of craving a sandwich, imagine craving righteousness, longing to see God's justice, mercy, and goodness fill every broken place in our world. This is the hunger that Jesus is talking about. This is the people that he is speaking to. They knew what it was like to be hungry. See, unlike most of us, many of Jesus' original listeners had experienced real hunger. Not the mild discomfort of skipping lunch, but they knew what starvation was like. Food was scarce. Clean water wasn't easily accessible. People ached for nourishment. They longed for relief. And yet Jesus looks at them and he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Not just for food, but for righteousness. Blessed are those who have this intense, consuming longing to see the world made right, to see God's justice break into the brokenness around them. In other words, Jesus is asking, do you desire righteousness with the same intensity that a starving person desires food? Do you thirst for God's justice the way a parched traveler longs for water? This isn't just about wishing things were better. This is being so aware of the absence of righteousness that you can't rest until you see God's kingdom come. And as I was preparing for this message, I was thinking about a man by the name of George Mueller, a man who lived out what it means to hunger and thirst for righteousness in the everyday struggles of life. George Mueller wasn't a politician. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a person of influence, just an ordinary man who trusted an extraordinary God and said, "God, whatever you want me to do, I would do." And in 19th century Bristol, England, he saw orphan children abandoned on the streets with no safety net, and something in him broke, and he couldn't look away. And he had no financial backing or government support. He began to open his home one orphan at a time. And then another orphan came, and another orphan came, and soon thousands of orphans were living in orphanages that Mueller began to build. Pretty soon, over 10,000 children was cared for by Mueller, giving them food, education, and love. And you know what's incredible is he never fundraised. He never asked for money. Instead, every day he would pray. When his orphanages would have no food and no money and no idea how they'd feed their children, he simply would gather their children together and he would pray over empty plates and he would wait. And every single time God showed up. A baker would bring extra bread, a milk cart would break down outside, a last-minute check would arrive, and Mueller's life wasn't flashy and it wasn't easy, but he hungered for righteousness in the lives of the forgotten and trusted that God would provide. And Jesus would say to Mueller and he would say to us, "Blessed are us when we hunger like that." The story, it connects with me because most of us think that we've got to be people of influence to make a difference. And you don't. All you have to do is look around and see the brokenness around us and say, "God, how are you inviting me to step in? How are you inviting me to care? How are you inviting me to love?" Every single one of us in this room will encounter places of brokenness. Maybe you look at a broken relationship, a friendship that's fallen apart, a marriage that's in crisis, a family that's divided, and you long for healing, you ache for restoration. Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you go to work every day and you see how people are treated like cogs in a machine, overworked, undervalued, underpaid, and something inside of you won't let it go, and you hunger to see fairness, dignity, and justice in your workplace. And Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you can't shake the reality that in our city, thousands of kids in our metroplex are 300 times less likely to succeed simply because of the zip code that they were born into. And it eats at you. And you can't stop thinking about it. And you ache to long to see change happen. And Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you scroll through the news and feel the weight of the division and the hatred in our world, the way people tear each other apart online and in politics and even in the church, and it grieves you. And you long for the day when people will listen and love and seek peace instead of shouting at each other. And Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you see a friend struggling with addiction, someone you love making destructive choices, pushing people away, spiraling down into a path that you could wish you could pull them out of, and your heart aches for them to find freedom. And Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you're a parent raising children in a world that feels upside down, and you hunger for them to know truth, to be kind, to walk in wisdom, and you pray over them every night because you long for them to grow into who God made them to be. And Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you have a passion for mentoring young people, investing into the next generation, and you see students who are confused and lonely and question your faith, and you want them to know that they are seen and known and loved. And Jesus says, you're blessed. Maybe you're in a caregiving role, walking alongside a sick parent, a family member with a chronic illness, or a loved one battling depression, and you ache for them to be whole, for them to experience peace, for them to know that they are not alone in their struggle. And to you, my friend, Jesus says, you are blessed. Maybe you feel the burden of the foster care system, knowing that there are children that go to bed every night without a stable home, without love, without someone fighting for them. And you can't just move on like everything is fine. And to you, Jesus says, you are blessed. Maybe you have a neighbor or a coworker who doesn't know Jesus, and it weighs on you, and you pray for them, and you love them, and you look for ways to share the love of Jesus to them because you hunger for them to know life and life abundantly. And Jesus says to you, you are blessed. And maybe you feel the tension in your own soul, that you long to be more like Jesus, but you see the gap between who you are and who you want to be, but you hunger to grow, you hunger for change, to live more fully in his kingdom, to say, I don't want these things to hold my life down. I want to be the person that God's called me to be, and you ache for it. And Jesus says to you, friend, you are blessed. The good life is not for those who are satisfied. The world tells us the blessed life is the comfortable life. It's the full stomach. It's the stress-free existence. But Jesus flips that on its head. In Luke 6, Jesus says these words, woe to you who are full. Woe to you who have all that you need. The good life is not making sure you are comfortable. The good life is for those who are hungry. And here's the paradox. The people who are most alive are the ones who feel the absence of God's kingdom most deeply. Jesus is showing us what it means to truly live. Because a life that's focused only on comfort and happiness and our security is actually a very small life. But a life that aches for the kingdom, that's a life that has purpose. That's a life that matters. Ask anyone that's lived long enough. There is a strange, counterintuitive truth of life. If you chase happiness, you will never find it. I've never met a rich man that said they were content. They're still always chasing for more. But if you seek God's kingdom, if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you'll experience something that is far deeper than the world's definition of happiness. There's some things you can't get by aiming at them directly. They only come as byproducts of pursuing something even greater. Aim at happiness and you'll never find it. Aim at God's kingdom and you'll get not just happiness, but joy also thrown in. Aim at your own comfort and you'll find neither. I love what Archbishop Rowan says. He says, what we need to be authentically ourselves, the nourishment will allow us to grow as we should, is the well-being of others, our neighbors. We are as dependent for our life and flourishing on the well-being of our neighbors as we are on the food that we eat. Do you see it? The good life is not about finding our own fulfillment, but it's in seeking the righteousness of God's kingdom. And Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. All right, last point. What does Jesus promise to those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? First of all, what is righteousness? It's the world that's made whole. The broken restored, the hurting healed, the lost found. Who are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? They are the ones who ache for the goodness of God's kingdom to break through. the ones who feel the weight of what is wrong in this world and can't help but long for what is right. And what is God's promise to them? They will be filled. Here's where the promise gets really interesting. The Greek word that Jesus uses here is an unusual one. It's typically used to describe when you fatten an animal before slaughtering them, meaning to be completely, abundantly satisfied, stuffed to the brim, full to the point where you can't take in another bite. Think about that for a moment. Jesus isn't just offering us partial fulfillment. He's not saying, hey, you'll just get enough to survive. He's saying that those who hunger for righteousness will be so deeply, overwhelmingly satisfied that they will lack nothing. That they will lack nothing. About once a year, around Anne's birthday, our family goes to a Brazilian steakhouse. I don't know if you've ever been to a Brazilian steakhouse, but let me tell you this. It is a small glimpse of what heaven is going to look like. My apologies to any of you vegetarians in the room, but when I think about a heavenly banquet, I imagine sitting at a table and the angels, like those servers in the white shirts and the bow ties, are just coming up to us, offering us endless cuts of perfectly seasoned meat carved right onto our plates. Filet mignon? Yes, please. Garlic sirloin? Yes, please. Bacon wrapped anything? Let's go. Grilled pineapples? Come, Lord Jesus, come, right? And if you've ever been to one of these places, you know the key to getting the most out of your meal is that you don't eat anything beforehand, right? You prepare for this meal. You don't waste your appetite on snacks beforehand. You don't fill up on bread. You come hungry because you know the hungrier you are, the better it's going to taste. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. The more you hunger for righteousness, the more you crave for his justice, for his presence, for his goodness, the more deeply you'll be satisfied when you taste it. Because if you spend your life filling up on things that don't truly nourish you, you will miss the feast that Jesus is offering you. Some of us are walking around spiritually full, but not on the right things. We've been snacking on things that will never satisfy us. I want to be successful. I want to be comfortable. I want to be entertained. I want the approval of everyone around me. I want all this and that. I want this technology and I want that technology. And what Jesus is offering us, friends, is something so much better. And because we filled ourselves with junk, we don't have room for what Jesus offers us. And Jesus is inviting us to say, stop filling yourself with things that don't last. Come to me hungry, and I will fill you in a way that nothing in this world will ever satisfy. And here's the best part. This is a meal that will never run out. You know, at the Brazilian steakhouse, I've got to flip my card over eventually to red because that indicates, hey, I can't take anymore. But in the kingdom of God, I never have to flip that card. The more you hunger, the more you'll be filled. And the more you crave his righteousness, the more he'll pour out on us. And when the day finally comes, when we sit at the real banquet table of heaven, when the broken world is made whole, when every hunger is fully satisfied in him, friends, oh, what a feast that's going to be. Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And so the question is, are you coming to the feast hungry? Are you coming to the feast hungry? And here's where it gets more beautiful. The ultimate fulfillment of this hunger is not found in a cause or a movement or even in our best efforts to bring righteousness into the world. It is found in Jesus himself. In John chapter 6, Jesus makes this statement to us. He says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall not thirst. Think about that statement for a moment. Jesus does not say, I will give you the bread of life. He says, I am the bread of life. He's not just offering us something to temporarily satisfy our hunger. He is giving us himself. And then one chapter over in John chapter 7, Jesus says these words. He says, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Friends, the promise of Jesus is this, that if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, you will be filled. Not with an idea, not with a feeling, not even with justice in the world around you, but you will be filled with Jesus. But notice something really important here. Jesus doesn't bless the righteous. He blesses those who know they lack it. Jesus doesn't bless those who are full. He blesses those who are empty. He doesn't bless those who are self-satisfied. He blesses those who are desperate. Because righteousness is not something we achieve. It's something that we receive from the Father. And those who recognize their need, those who come to Jesus hungry and thirsty, will find that he alone and he alone can satisfy. So here's where we need to get honest with ourselves. What are you hungering after? So many of us spend our entire lives chasing after things that will never satisfy. Things that look good. Things that on the surface are like, man, that would be really good for me. But they dissolve the moment we taste them. It's like at the fair, cotton candy, right? It looks big and fluffy and satisfying, but the second you put it in your mouth, it like quickly disappears. It doesn't nourish you. It doesn't sustain you. In fact, if you eat too much of it, you actually end up getting sick. And so many of us have been filling ourselves with cotton candy. We chase success, thinking it will bring us worth, only to find that it leaves us empty. We chase approval of others, thinking it will make us feel loved, only to realize it's never enough. We chase pleasure, thinking it will satisfy us, only to find that it fades away. We chase comfort, thinking it will bring us peace, only to find that at the end of the day, our souls are still restless. And Jesus is saying, stop settling for things that dissolve. Stop settling for cotton candy. Enjoy some Jesus-made Brazilian steakhouse. Stop filling yourselves with things that don't satisfy. Stop numbing your hunger with empty things. Come to me, and I will fill you with something real. I've got so much to offer you that will truly satisfy your life. But here's the paradox of this beatitude. When we come to Jesus, we are satisfied, but our hunger continues to grow. The more we taste his righteousness, the more we want his righteousness. The more we experience his kingdom, the more we want to see more of his kingdom come. We live in this space, the full but still longing, satisfied yet still aching, at peace and yet still restless for more of God's mercy and justice and truth. And this is what it means to follow Jesus, to live in this place of holy hunger at all times. It means that when we wake up in the morning every day, we say, Jesus, fill me today because I need you more than anything else. It means that we say, Jesus, I'm not satisfied with the way things are. I long for your kingdom to come. Your will be done. It means, Jesus, I refuse to be full on the things that I will not last. I want to hunger for what truly matters. And to you, Jesus says, blessed are you, for you will be full. Let me close. What is righteousness? It is a world being made right. It is everything in this world being restored. It is justice where there is once oppression. It is healing where there once was pain. It is relationships mended, truth prevailing, love winning. Who are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? They're the ones who refuse to be satisfied with the way things are. They're the ones who live with a holy discontent, a deep, restless longing to see God's kingdom break through in their own lives, in their families, in their neighborhoods, in their cities, in their world. They're the ones who cannot turn a blind eye to injustice, who cannot shrug off brokenness, who feel the ache and choose to step into it rather than away from it. And what does Jesus promise? They will be filled. Not with temporary happiness, not with the fleeting satisfaction of earthly success, but something that is real, lasting, and soul satisfying. The righteousness of God himself. Friends, this is the good life. Not for those who are comfortable, but for those who recognize and know their lack. Not for those who have figured everything out, but for those who see the deep absence of righteousness in their own hearts and in the world, and who turn to Jesus alone as the bread that truly satisfies. So my prayer for us, Love City, is that God would make us a hungry people. Not just curious about righteousness, not just interested in justice, but hungry. Aching for the kind of righteousness that only God can bring. Hungry to see our families healed. Hungry to see our communities transformed. Hungry to see God's justice where there's oppression. Hungry to see the lost come home. Hungry to see our lives reflect Jesus. Because Jesus tells us, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. This morning as we prepare for communion, I invite you to reflect one more time. What are you hungry for? What are you hungry for? What is it that you most long for in this season? What is it that you keep running to, hoping it will satisfy you, only to find that it keeps fading away, that it is never enough? Before we take communion, would you take a moment? Would you be honest with yourself? Would you be honest with God? And I invite you to name that hunger before God. There is no shame in it. He already knows it. But would you name it and bring it to God? Would you lay it down? And then in the quiet of your heart, would you just picture yourself coming to Jesus, the bread of life, the living water, with empty hands, an empty plate, a thirsty soul, a hungry heart, and then would you picture Jesus just filling you up today? Because the truth of it is, only he can satisfy. At the center of our faith is a meal. At the center of our faith is a table. At the center of our faith is bread and juice. The Savior who looked at his disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body broken for you. Take, drink, this is my blood poured out for you. And at that table, on the night before he went to the cross, Jesus wasn't just offering us a meal, he was offering us himself. Friends, this is what communion is. It's an invitation for us to come hungry, to acknowledge that we have nothing in and of ourselves that can satisfy, and to feast on the grace and mercy of Jesus, the righteousness of Jesus, the finished work of Jesus on the cross. You and I do not come to this table with our own goodness. We don't come because we've earned it. We don't come because we are already righteous. We come hungry. We come longing for what only he can give: forgiveness, healing, wholeness, righteousness that we can never earn, but he freely gives. I want to invite you to come to the table today. I want to invite you to prepare your heart, to lay down those things that will not satisfy, to bring your hunger and longing and your need before God and let him fill you. Because, friends, Jesus is enough. If you need prayer this morning, our prayer team is in the back. They're ready and available to pray with you. Before you come and grab the elements, I invite you to go back, pray with them. Whether it's something you've heard this morning or something that's going on in your life, they'd love to pray with you this morning. So take some time, pray with them. The way we do communion here, the worship team's going to lead us in song. I'm going to invite you to come down the middle aisle, grab the elements, go back, invite you to stand. Then we will feast of the table together as we are reminded that he is more than enough for us. Let's worship.